today I'm going to talk largely about the Alaska Land Carbon Assessment and where we're at in terms of conducting that assessment. So this is a team. It was largely organized by USGS, but these are some of the members of the team that were at our meeting in, I think, August of 2014, where we were basically pulling together the information that goes into the USGS report. And the USGS report is in production right now. We're hoping that it'll be available online by the end of March. The chapters are all done, the reviews are all done on them. It's just a matter of going through the production and then making them available online, and that's being taken care of out of Reston. So basically, the assessment is completed, and where we're going from here is we have an invited feature ecological applications, and so we're planning to publish about 6 papers in ecological applications related to the assessment. So why did we conduct this assessment? Well, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 mandated that the Department of Interior conduct a carbon sequestration assessment, and that was actually split into 2 parts. There was a geological sequestration component and a biological sequestration component. So the biological sequestration component was organized by Zhilong Zhu in Reston, and so they did it in phases. They did the conterminous U.S., and then they turned to doing it in Alaska and Hawaii because of the special issues involved there. And so the scope of the assessments are to assess carbon storage and sequestration and fluxes of various greenhouse gases. They need to treat all major ecosystems in the U.S. They need to generate both current baseline and future projections, and the effects of natural and anthropogenic processes in all 50 states. So the conterminous U.S. biological sequestration or assessment report has been available online since about 2014, and so the Alaska assessment will, as I indicated, be available hopefully by the end of next month. And Hawaii assessment's a little bit behind that, but I think the plan is for that to be finished by the end of the year. So the methodology that we employed was to largely use as much input data as we could for the Alaska region, and that informed vegetation dynamics, fire dynamics, permafrost dynamics, and hydrologic dynamics. And the assessment itself was we dealt with uplands and wetlands and surface waters separately, and I think that's a fairly unique aspect of this assessment. In other assessments, I've seen the uplands and wetlands and surface water parts of it. There's the potential for some double accounting. So we took care in this assessment to sort of minimize those double accounting issues. But we also conducted some analyses of carbon in Southeast Alaska, largely because some of the forest and inventory analysis data available for Southeast and South Central Alaska allowed us to look at some carbon issues there that we couldn't really look at in the rest of the state. And so, the last box on this diagram indicates the analysis, synthesis, report development, data distribution, and communication. So we're at the very tail end of this, and actually this is the communication part of it is part of what I'm doing today. So just the assessment had a historical and a projection period, and the historical period went from 1950 to 2009, and the projection period went from 2010 to 2099. So with respect to uplands and wetlands, I'm showing the modeling framework that we used here. And so basically, we have basically three components models that we used. One was this dynamic organic soil version of the terrestrial ecosystem model, which has an environmental module, an organic soil module, an ecological module, and a disturbance module that sort of tracks, and these all interact to model carbon dynamics. The fire occurrence information for the future came from Alfresco. We used historical fire information for driving it in the historical period. And then there's this other, this methane dynamics module that that we used to estimate methane emissions across the landscape in uplands and wetlands. The methodology for surface waters was a little bit different, and I'll talk about that real briefly, but I wanted to give you a sense of what we were doing here. And actually, in terms of what supported this methodology, some of you may have heard of the integrated ecosystem model for Alaska and Northwest Canada. That was, we really leveraged off of that activity, and that activity has been supported by the Alaska Climate Science Center. And yeah, I just wanted to mention a few things and so about that, and so the idea here was to be able to simulate ecosystem dynamics for Alaska and Northwest Canada, so that the output of the modeling framework could be used to assess impacts on natural resources. So, for example, for habitat and species vulnerability that could inform conservation action. So this has been an ongoing project, and so the fact that we were working on this provided a lot of the infrastructure that allowed us to do the Alaska carbon assessment in a fairly efficient manner. So just to give you a sense of what's in the IEM, there's Alfresco on the left, which models fire disturbance and vegetation dynamics. The dynamic organic soil version of MS models, biogeochemistry, and so there's some feedback on the line. I don't know if somebody could maybe mute their line there. That's better. Okay.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, I think it's one of the lines that you're on. So if Andrew could go to mute, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry.
So yeah, this model framework is driven by aspects of the landscape on the bottom here, slope aspect over to mineral soil texture, and then by time varying data and spatially varying data sets in terms of air temperature, vegetation, and initial vegetation here. And this is all done at 1 kilometer resolution for the simulation area. And so we're working on having these models communicate with each other. In this first sort of phase, what we've done is we've just done a one-way. We've gone from Alfresco to DOS-Chem to the Geophysical Institute Permafrost Lab. So we're just going from left to right now in terms of what I'm going to describe to you for today. And actually, the Alaska Land Carbon project just includes the alfresco and the DOS TEM part. The simulation area for the IEM is shown here. And so largely it's to support assessments in the Arctic Landscape Conservation Cooperative, the Northwest Boreal, the Western Alaska, and the part of the North Pacific that's within Alaska, down here. So we've got this large simulation area, and actually the data sets from alfresco and from the DOS TEM part are available now. From what I'm going to describe, they're available up on the Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic Planning website already for anybody who's interested. So the climate drivers. Here I'm showing the historical temperature and the historical precipitation across the simulation domain, but we did 6 simulations into the future across 3 emission scenarios: the B1, the A1B, and the A2, you know, the B1 being less warm, the A1B being somewhat intermediate warming, and then the A2 being the warmest. And then we conducted it for 2 climate models that were applied across these emission scenarios, and so the ECHAM5 and the Canadian model, CCCMA. And so there's 6 simulations into the future. The reporting regions for the Alaska Land Carbon Assessment was for the uplands and wetlands is shown on the left. It's largely by the Landscape Conservation Cooperative boundaries, although we decided to divide the Northwest Boreal region into both the northern and southern region. And this is because the fire dynamics are substantially different north and south of the Alaska Range is the reason why we split this. I haven't talked much about the inland water assessment, but that part of the assessment was organized by these major hydrologic units that I'm showing on the right-hand side here from southeast to the north slope. And it's largely because of how the data the stream data is organized. So just to give you a sense, and I'm showing this for the northern and northwest boreal, you know, we have a land cover map that describes the distribution of ecosystem types within that domain. We have wetland cover, and so here's a percent of wetland cover. You can see that it does pick up some of the major, like the Yukon Flats, major wetland complexes in the region. And then we have mineral soil content on the left here. So we evaluated the alfresco simulations of fire dynamics. And so here you can see the cumulative area burned by year of alfresco. Alfresco runs 200 ensemble, and you can see compared to the historical here that it's capturing basically the amount of area burned through time from 1950 out to through 2009 in this case. But we also evaluated alfresco in terms of the cumulative area burned versus fire size, and so this just gives you an idea. There's we have what we call a best boreal replicate. This is a replicate that reproduces the pattern in the boreal the best, and the blue is the best is the simulation that reproduces the fire pattern in the tundra region the best. And then you can see the historical. So the alfresco does have, compared to the historical, tends to overestimate the number of small burns and slightly underestimate the number of large burns. It gives you a sense here of what they're doing. So just to show you the alfresco future simulations here, the left-hand diagram just shows the pattern of the simulated fire scars for the historical period. And then on the right, we can see the historical in black here, and then the fire, the cumulative fire in terms of area burned by alfresco for these 6 different climate simulations that were used to drive the model. And so you can see some of them. Mostly the ECHAM5 result in more area burned, and the somewhat less warm Canadian model, CCMA, shows less area burned. Okay, so just to also give you a sense of what alfresco says for vegetation change, and this is just for the northern northwest boreal LCC. So we can see that black spruce declines through time, deciduous forest increases through time, graminoid tundra decreases through time, shrub tundra tends to increase through time, and white spruce declines through time. So basically suggesting, well, what the model says is that the landscape in interior Alaska will become more deciduous and less coniferous.
Hey, Dave, can I ask a question on that last slide there?
Sure.
The shrub tundra has a weird pattern. It like declines drastically in the next couple of decades, and then it starts to increase.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I can explain those dynamics on the phone to you in terms of that decline. The decline does happen for, the biggest decline happens for this A2 scenario, and which suggests that the fire pattern there decreases the shrub tundra initially, because a lot of the fire that occurs, if you look closely at these simulations, there's a lot of fire between now and in terms of the increase in fires between now and sort of the middle of the century, and then there becomes enough deciduous forest in interior Alaska that there's a feedback against increasing fire further, and so some of this might be due to So that there's some similar patterns in the tundra regions. Remember, this is all within the northern northwest boreal. So this is tundra at elevation mostly.
I see.
But we do see in general, if we were to look at the Arctic LCC or the Western Alaska LCC, we would see these same patterns of graminoid tundra decreasing, and there the shrub tundra substantially expands at the expense of graminoid tundra because of fire. And so Amy Breen's writing a paper on that right now. So she would be the person, I think, to primarily contact with respect to the details.
Thanks.
Okay. I just want to point out, I don't want to go through these in too much depth, but we did evaluate the permafrost distribution estimates of DOS-TEM, which are, I think are which are in D, and then we've got several products, one from Statsco in A, this remote sensing-based product from PASTIC and all that was published a few months ago, and then the Geophysical Institute Permafrost Lab has its estimates, and then the DOS-TEM estimates. So these are kind of the presence-absence patterns estimated from these different methods, and they're generally reasonably consistent, but there are some differences. The other thing we did was we evaluated the soil carbon estimates produced by DOS-TEM, and so DOS-TEM is in the big open circles. You can see for Arctic regions, it's kind of in the middle of a bunch of different ways of estimating carbon in those regions, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in estimating carbon, depending on how you upscale the pedons. And and you can see for Arctic and Western Alaska, and for the southern interior, kind of in the middle. One of the things that we did notice is for northern interior Alaska, that the TEM estimates tended to show less soil carbon, and so one of the things we're wondering, and we don't have a resolution on this, is that the model itself includes fire, and if you look at most of the pedons, they're out of mature systems. So it's a question of, is the model biased or is the data biased? Because it doesn't have enough coverage on disturbed on the distribution or the stand age distribution of ecosystems in a region where there's a fair amount of fire. So it's not something we've resolved yet, but it's something to be aware of, that that the soil pedon databases can have their own biases potentially. But this shows the evaluation of the if we break down the soil C by ecosystems, and in terms of observed patterns versus modeled patterns, and if we do that for both vegetation carbon and as well, is that generally the model does pick up the pattern of carbon storage across the landscape in Alaska. So what are some of the what does the model say about changes in carbon balance? And so first of all, I'm just going to show you the pattern for this terrestrial boreal Alaska, this northern northwest boreal. And so here you can see the model says that since between 1950 and 2009, vegetation carbon decreased and soil carbon decreased, and we can see the exchanges with the atmosphere here, so that ecosystems in interior Alaska lost 7.9 teragrams carbon per year during that time period. But the one thing you can see if you look at the estimates, and so this is cumulative change in carbon storage, and so you can see that carbon tends to increase until it hits a big fire year, and then it drops, then it decreases, and then it recovers until it hits another big fire year and it decreases, and then there was a long period of recovery here, and then fire in 1990 caused it to decrease, and then it started to recover, and then it decreased substantially with the 2004 and 2005 fires. So it suggests, at least in interior Alaska, that the carbon storage is very volatile because of fire itself, and that gains that you can make over decades can be wiped out in a single year, and And the most recent fires have put the system into suggests that the system's in a carbon deficit. And so this is just for terrestrial Alaska. I want to shift gears here and just talk a little bit about the estimates of carbon fluxes from inland waters. So this was largely a data-driven activity, and you can see in the upper left here the data that's on the for the data, the locations of the data for the river fluxes in terms of the transport of carbon towards the coast, and B, the data for the river exchange of carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. In the bottom left here, the data locations for lake CO2 emissions, and then the data locations for organic carbon burial. So all these data were used to produce the estimates, and so on a statewide basis. So this diagram differs a little bit from the previous in terms of it's a statewide basis. So you can see here that we've estimated CO2 evasion and burial, which is a fairly small component, and then coastal export. And right now the data on CH4 evasion is still being analyzed by Rob Striegel's group in Boulder. So if you add all that up, it indicates that 41.2 teragrams, at least from these three components, is flowing through the system. But statewide, what our analysis indicates for the historical period is that we've got a slight loss of vegetation carbon and actually a gain in soil carbon across this time. So what this suggests is that areas like Arctic tundra are more than, and Southeast Alaska are more than compensating for the losses that we're seeing in the boreal region. And so one of the things that we don't quite know is how to connect up these two, because they're completely different analyses. One way is to reduce this RH by this 41.2 teragrams and put that into here in terms of the flow of carbon into the system. But that may or may not be correct to do.
Dave?
Yep.
What's RH?
Oh, sorry. RH is the decomposition of soil organic matter. It's a heterotrophic respiration. Thanks. Yeah. So generally, most of the carbon comes in as net primary production, and it leaves as decomposition. But there are losses from fire and then losses from methane emissions. Okay. So the projections for Alaska, in contrast with the historical period, and here you can see what we project between 2010 and 2100 with modeling framework in terms of what the changes in vegetation and soil carbon are. So in all cases, we're showing that vegetation and soil carbon are increasing. This kind of masks that, there are some decreases that would be seen for interior Alaska because of fire, but that the Arctic and other regions would be storing carbon according to this modeling framework. And then you can see the various components: MPP, heterotrophic respiration, the fire emissions, which increase substantially. You can see here, for example, these the CCM, the A1B fire emissions, annual fire emissions are quite large, and for the ESHAM A2 are quite large. But when you add it all together, you end up getting this net ecosystem carbon balance that is positive, and even though you do have these big fires. However, when you when you calculate global warming potential, you get actually that the landscape acts as a cooling feedback to climate. The negative means that it's a cooling here, except for one scenario, this ESHAM 5A2, which indicates that the forcing from methane, which is 2.7, you can see is much larger than the other scenarios, ends up causing it to be a warming feedback. So some take-home messages here. So this is for the historical period. Upland and wetland ecosystems of Alaska are estimated to have gained 3.7 teragrams per year, which is about 2% of MPP. But the sequestration is spatially variable, with the northern northwest boreal region losing carbon. So we estimate that the combined carbon loss through various pathways of the aquatic systems was 41.2, or about 17% of upland and wetland NPP. So this is an important result there. And we estimate that the greenhouse gas forcing potential of upland and wetland ecosystems of Alaska was probably neutral during the historical period, but that the state as a whole could be a source of greenhouse gas forcing to the climate systems from the emissions from lakes ecosystems. And if you remember right, we didn't estimate those emissions, so that's one thing we're trying to resolve now. And then a major uncertainty of the historical assessment is related to the fact that the aquatic inland ecosystems were not able to be directly integrated with upland and wetland ecosystems. And in other words, we don't know quite how much double accounting there might be between them. It could be minimal, but my sense is that there is a certain level of double accounting by treating them separately. So the take-home messages from the projected dynamics is that in the projection period, the carbon sequestration of upland and wetland ecosystems would increase substantially, primarily because of an increase of MPP of 8 to 19% associated with various responses, but they include responses to rising atmospheric CO2, increased nitrogen cycling, and longer growing seasons. Yeah, although the CO2 emissions to the atmosphere from wildfire increase substantially for all the projected climates, the increases in MPP more than compensate for those losses. So a big question is how accurate is this 8 to 19% increase, across the rest of the century? It's a 10 to 20% increase in productivity. And that our analysis indicates that upland and wetland ecosystems would be sinks for greenhouse gases for all scenarios during the projection period. However, as in the case of the analysis of the historical period, there's uncertainty about whether the state would be a net source if the emissions from lakes were considered. And so this is for future work, if this assessment is conducted, is to try to deal with some of these issues. Since this is the wildfire team, I thought that I'd just add a couple of things that the IEM is doing that are relevant. And so one of the things that we're doing is in association with this TURDIP project that we have is to develop models that can forecast landscape change in response to projected changes in climate, fire regime, and fire management. And so you can see that that was part of what we had done here. But we had three objectives here with respect to fire, or three questions. How does simulated fire frequency respond to different climate scenarios in and adjacent to military lands in the Upper Tanana hydrologic basin? How might changes in fire management options within the military training land boundaries influence the frequency and extent of wildfire? And then how might wildlife habitat suitability change on these lands because of these changes? So some of this is, there's this recent paper published by Monica Califf that shows that if you compare the mean annual area burned from 1988 to 2012, and you compare the various fire management regions, you can see that human suppression and critical and full and to a certain extent modified areas is substantially reduced burning compared to the limited areas, and so Alfresco is using this information to try to represent these fire management regions on the landscape. So this is one way that we're expanding the Alfresco activities. And so the idea here is to, have the model simulate the natural fire regime from 1900 to 1980, implement the fire management options in 1980, and then run them out to 2100. And then also to consider some scenarios for switching. So the natural fire regime out to 1980, the current fire management options out to about 2013, and then run some new management scenarios. So for example, one of the things that our discussions with people at Fort Wainwright have indicated is they're wondering whether, if they switched some of their areas from modified to full, how much of an impact might that have in terms of the vulnerability of area burned and whether fire might escape from their lands. So we're kind of in the middle of this project, but I thought I'd bring it up because I thought it is of general interest to the group. Final thing I want to do is just acknowledge, I acknowledge the people in the Alaska Land Carbon Project, but the behind the scenes with respect to the IEM project is a number of people that some of whom weren't directly part of the Alaska Land Carbon Project per se, but their activities have been important with respect to providing the infrastructure and the science progress that we've had in this, and a number of agencies and institutions supporting this effort. Chief among them probably is the Alaska Climate Science Center, but also the various landscape conservation cooperatives. So I'll finish it up there. I probably ran a little bit beyond the half hour I had planned, but if there's questions, I'll take them.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's really interesting, and I guess it's sort of taken as a whole package. Maybe could be said to be a little bit of good news in terms of resiliency in the face of disturbance regimes. Any questions for Dave?
Yeah. I should point out, Randy, that there's still uncertainties there, and I think especially with respect to carbon, I think this question about will MPP actually increase this 10 to 20% across the rest of the century compared to the 1950 to 2009 period is an important issue for us to resolve. and I feel a lot more confident about, our ability to use modeling framework to sort of simulate changes in carbon storage associated with fire per se, just because we've had a lot of experience in terms of doing that. But I still don't have a good feel about whether we're properly constrained with respect to this MPP response.
The slides that you showed for in boreal forest day as examples, did you say that the same information graphs are available for like those other areas for the tundra, for example, at the website? If one wanted to look at for other areas of the state besides the Northwest Boreal?
So all the raw data at 1 kilometer resolution is available. But Scott Rupp's group is producing some specific products that that aggregate the information up to areas of interest, like the landscape conservation cooperative areas. And I don't know if I know that work is ongoing right now. I don't know if those specific graphs are available, but all the raw data out of the simulations is available for as GeoTIFF files for anyone that wants to look at any sort of unit. For example, if somebody were wanting to look at for just the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, they could pick up those GeoTIFF files and then process the data to look at them. So Scott's doing some of that, and it's been an ongoing discussion with the LCCs, so I'm not quite sure exactly what was decided upon in terms of making those available. But the graphs I showed here, those are available in the USGS report for just Alaska per se, and so those will be available for anybody who downloads the report at the end of by the end of March, hopefully.
Hi, Dave. This is Lisa. I may have missed it, but could you just summarize how you're incorporating in the projections, particularly burn severity in terms of depth of burning into the substrate, into the carbon emissions?
Yeah.
The burn severity changes with the regime?
So we have a model that it was largely developed for interior Alaska in terms of the factors controlling depth of burning, and Helene Jeanette published that in 2013. It doesn't necessarily have all the factors in it that we'd like it to have, but it does have some of the factors that she was able to sort of articulate out from some of Kirsten Barrett's work, and because Kirsten had published a couple of papers back in 2010 and 2011 on some of these analyses that she had conducted, and then Helene had followed up on that in terms of sort of tailoring the model for what we could use in our simulations. So there's certain landscape positions that end up having deeper burning, and so that sort of variability is included in our simulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but I do think, like, you know, some of the fire weather things that yeah, I'd like to see built into that are yeah, are not to the degree that I'd like to see them incorporated yet.
So, for example, this is one of the problems that Jeremy Littell probably would bring up if he were on the call, that we are using the historical data to project what's going to happen in the future, but we know that things are going to change in terms of the fire weather indices and relative humidities and the number of, you know, and the way that fire behaves under perhaps warmer conditions, and fuel types might change a little bit, and it's hard to capture those in the models that are built on a status quo sort of fire relationship. So there is a little bit of uncertainty built in there, I think. Like, yeah, we don't know right now, under the status quo model, deciduous forest does provide a sort of feedback, so less conducive to fire spread under current weather fire indexes regimes. But if in a warmer future, will those deciduous forests still help moderate fire behavior or not, is still a little bit of a question.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's like whether you know, whether the system could go towards an aspen parkland where, you know, fire levels stay fairly high, but you know, they create more of a savanna sort of situation, or not. Yeah, so you know, that's one thing that's kind of gone through my mind in terms of you know, whether, you know, what will it stay high, or will you know, or will we get, you know, will the landscape not be an aspen parkland and be more of a you know, just a you know, a larger proportion of deciduous forest that yeah, might tone down the fire cycle because of their lower flammability. But as you indicate, you know, there is some evidence out there that, you know, once you do get fires going in a large fire year, nothing, you know, whether you're once they get going, whether you're deciduous or conifer, yeah, it doesn't necessarily make a big difference, because it just depends what the fire weather is, and if the wind decides to blow into a deciduous stand, you may not be able to stop it very well.
Great. Well, we're just about to the end of our hour, so unless there's a last quick question for Dave, I wonder if we should move on to the rest of the agenda.
Here, I'll try to get this